The moment 50 Cent's name got linked to Diddy again, most people thought it was just another headline, another rumor, another clip taken out of context. But this wasn't noise. It wasn't chaos. It was quiet, controlled, almost surgical. And when something involving Diddy moves this quietly, that's when it's the most dangerous. Because when someone like 50 Cent starts moving without talking much, it's never accidental. He doesn't do things for shock alone. He does them to signal something, and this time, that signal wasn't aimed at fans. It was aimed at people who already knew exactly what it meant. What shook people wasn't even what was allegedly said. It was who suddenly stopped speaking after it surfaced. No denials, no jokes, no tweets brushing it off, just silence. And in the world of power, silence is rarely innocence. It's usually strategy. Before we go any further, pause for a second. Look at the pattern, not the personalities, because this isn't about fandom. It's not about who you like or whose music you grew up on. It's about why certain names keep orbiting the same controversies for decades, yet never seem to land. Quick question for you, and answer honestly in the comments. Do you think silence from powerful people means they have nothing to hide or everything to protect? And if you're here for deep dives like this not surface level noise, make sure you're subscribed. This story doesn't move in straight lines, and neither do we. Now let's rewind. For years, the public narrative around Diddy and Jay-Z has been carefully separated. Two different brands, two different images, two different lanes, one loud, one polished, one messy, one corporate. That contrast wasn't accidental, it was manufactured. Because the cleanest way to survive an industry built on secrets is to never look like you're standing too close to the fire. But here's the problem. Every time something major happens, a lawsuit, a leaked clip, an industry meltdown, the same names quietly reappear in the background. Not center stage, not quoted directly, just present. Guest lists, private events, backstage access, industry favors. And over time, people started noticing that one person always walked away untouched. That's where the unease comes from. 50 Cent didn't invent this conversation. He amplified it. And when he did, it wasn't through a rant or an interview. It was through fragments, screens, references, silence where reactions should have been. That's what made people nervous. Because the implication wasn't, look what I have. The implication was, you know what I have. There's a reason seasoned industry figures reacted differently than fans. Some laughed it off, others went quiet. A few suddenly remembered meetings they hadn't talked about in years. That's how you know this wasn't random. And then there's the timeline. This tension didn't start recently. It didn't begin with social media. It goes back almost 2 decades to a period when alliances were being formed, labels were consolidating power, and certain people were learning how to move influence without ever being seen moving it. Back then, if you controlled access, you controlled survival. And that's where the real story lives, because the people who lasted weren't always the most talented. They were the ones who understood leverage, who stayed one step removed from the mess, who let others take the public heat while they stayed above it. That's why the sudden resurfacing of old footage, old relationships, old quotes hit differently now. Context changes everything. What once looked like harmless proximity starts to feel like strategic distance management, especially when the same names keep showing up in civil discussions, industry whispers, and unofficial conversations that never quite make it into court, but never fully disappear either. And then there's the legal side. Here's what most viewers miss. When lawyers move quickly over reposts, commentary, or speculation, it's rarely about stopping misinformation. It's about controlling momentum. Because in high-profile situations, perception spreads faster than facts. And perception is dangerous when it starts asking the wrong questions. Why now? Why this reaction? Why this level of sensitivity? That's what made this different. Because if everything was truly baseless, the response would have been casual, dismissive, almost bored. Instead, it felt precise, like damage control before damage was fully visible. That's not proof of guilt, but it is proof of concern. As the story gained traction, more voices started stepping forward, not with new accusations, but with old memories. Things they'd brushed off years ago. Moments that felt strange in hindsight. Situations that didn't make sense until they were viewed through today's lens. And once that door opens, it doesn't close easily. People began connecting dots that were never meant to be connected publicly. Not because someone told them to, but because the silence created space for it. That's the paradox of power. The harder you try to control the narrative, the more attention shifts to what you're not saying. And that brings us to the real reason this matters. This isn't about proving anything in a single video. It's about understanding how influence actually operates when cameras are off, how reputations are protected, how distance is created without ever being declared, and why certain people seem to survive every storm without ever getting wet. Because when someone like 50 Cent decides to poke at that illusion, even subtly, it's never just entertainment. It's pressure, and pressure exposes cracks. The question isn't whether everything being discussed is true. The question is why these conversations refuse to die, and why, after all these years, the same silence keeps returning. What makes situations like this so unsettling isn't what's openly said, it's what isn't. Because in this industry, the loudest reactions usually come from people with the least to lose. The ones at the top don't yell. They wait. They let narratives burn themselves out. And for years, that strategy worked almost flawlessly, until it didn't. Because as the spotlight intensified around Diddy, something unexpected happened. Instead of the focus narrowing, it widened. People didn't just ask, what happened? They asked, who knew? And once that question enters the room, it doesn't care about branding, philanthropy, or carefully built legacies. It only cares about proximity. That's why old footage started resurfacing. Old interviews, old stage moments. Clips that once felt casual now carried weight. Not because they proved anything outright, but because they contradicted newer statements. When people say, they were never close, and the internet can pull up years of moments suggesting otherwise, trust erodes, and trust is currency. One of the most telling shifts wasn't public outrage. It was industry discomfort. You could feel it in how people spoke, carefully choosing words, leaning on hypotheticals, avoiding direct statements. That's usually a sign that nobody wants to be the first domino. Because once one person speaks too clearly, others are forced to respond. And that's where figures like Jaguar Wright enter the conversation. Whether people believe her or not isn't the point. The point is why voices like hers gain traction during moments like this. It's not because they're new. It's because timing changes how claims are received. Allegations that once lived on the fringes suddenly feel relevant when similar patterns emerge elsewhere. That's how narratives compound. And then there's the legal layer, the quietest but most powerful part of all this. Civil discussions don't need criminal charges to matter. They don't need convictions to cause ripple effects. All they need is enough consistency to make people nervous, enough smoke to make brands hesitate, enough questions to make partners distance themselves without explanation. That's why silence can be so damaging. Because when nothing is clarified, everything becomes possible in the public imagination. Some believe distancing happens quietly long before scandals go public. Relationships cool, appearances slow down, names stop being mentioned together. Not because of guilt, but because risk management demands separation. That's how people survive storms they see coming before anyone else does. And if that's true, then the timing of certain moves becomes impossible to ignore. Why now? Why this moment? Why these reactions? Those questions linger because they don't have clean answers. What complicates things further is how power reshapes perception. When someone spends decades untouchable, even minor scrutiny feels seismic. People aren't reacting just to allegations, they're reacting to the idea that the shield might be cracking. That's why so many conversations focus on image. Clean image versus messy image. Corporate respectability versus street reputation. Silence versus spectacle. But behind all of that is the same machinery, the same rooms, the same gatekeepers, the same unwritten rules about who gets protected and who gets exposed. And once audiences start seeing that machinery, they don't unsee it. That's why comparisons keep happening. Not because people are saying two situations are identical, but because patterns feel familiar. Power clustering, loyalists staying quiet, critics being framed as unstable or bitter, legal language doing the talking instead of people. These are not new tactics, they're just being noticed now. And then there's 50 Cent's role in all of this. He's not positioned as a journalist. He's not claiming to be a whistleblower. That's what makes his involvement more disruptive. He operates outside the expected lanes. He jokes, he posts, he lets implications breathe. And because of his history, people pay attention even when he doesn't explain himself. That ambiguity is intentional. It forces others to respond without him ever making a direct accusation. And that's a powerful position to be in, because every denial, every statement, every attempt to downplay closeness only adds fuel. The more people insist nothing is there, the more audiences wonder why so much effort is being spent saying it. That's the trap of overcorrection. Meanwhile, older industry figures, people who've seen cycles come and go, are watching quietly. Some are speaking now, not because they suddenly want attention, but because the climate has shifted. Platforms exist where their voices can't be filtered as easily, where stories don't need network approval to spread. And that changes the balance of power. What once could be buried now lingers. What once required gatekeepers now just needs an upload. That doesn't mean everything said is true, but it does mean control is no longer absolute. And for the first time in a long time, that reality seems to be settling in. The real tension isn't about whether something will explode tomorrow. It's about whether this slow erosion continues, whether silence keeps being interpreted as calculation instead of dignity, whether the public keeps connecting dots instead of forgetting them. Because history shows that reputations rarely collapse all at once. They crack slowly, they leak, they shift, and once that process starts, it doesn't stop just because someone wants it to. What makes this phase different from every other moment in the past isn't volume, it's endurance. In earlier cycles, controversy spiked fast and burned out just as quickly. A headline here, a clip there, then silence until the next distraction arrived. But this time, the pressure isn't dissipating. It's spreading sideways. Mainstream outlets that once avoided these conversations are now cautiously acknowledging them, not endorsing claims, not validating accusations, just admitting that questions exist. And in a media ecosystem built on risk avoidance, even that is a shift. Because once mainstream attention arrives, control changes hands. You can manage blogs. You can pressure platforms. You can wait out social media storms. But you can't easily outweigh institutional curiosity. That's why body language matters more than statements right now. Who shows up where? Who avoids which events? Who speaks freely and who suddenly needs representation to speak at all? These details don't prove anything, but they signal something. And audiences are reading those signals more carefully than ever. Another subtle change is happening too. People are no longer satisfied with surface explanations. They don't just want to know what happened. They want to understand how things were allowed to happen for so long without consequence. That question doesn't target one person, it targets systems. And systems don't defend themselves emotionally, they defend themselves procedurally. That's why legal language has become so central. Carefully worded statements, narrow denials, responses that address technicalities rather than perceptions. This isn't unusual, it's standard protocol, but it also creates distance, and distance can feel cold when people are demanding clarity. Which is why silence is being interpreted differently now. In the past, silence from powerful figures was framed as elegance, above the fray restraint. Today, many see it as avoidance. Not because anyone is owed personal explanations, but because silence no longer exists in a vacuum. It exists in an environment where others are talking nonstop. Former associates, industry veterans, people who were once dismissed as irrelevant. Their stories may contradict each other. Some may exaggerate. Some may misremember. But together they create a chorus that's harder to ignore than any single voice. And that's where the risk escalates. Because once enough people speak, the conversation stops being about individuals and starts being about patterns. And patterns don't require proof in the same way accusations do. They only require repetition and plausibility. That's dangerous territory for anyone whose image depends on being an exception. What's also changed is the audience itself. Viewers are more media literate than they were 10 or 20 years ago. They understand PR. They recognize deflection. They notice when lawyers speak instead of principles. They know the difference between a denial and a clarification. And they're patient. They don't need everything at once. They're willing to wait as long as the silence feels intentional rather than dismissive. That's why speculation hasn't cooled. It's matured. Instead of wild theories, people are focusing on timelines, on relationships, on moments where narratives don't align, on why certain explanations only emerge after scrutiny intensified rather than before. That doesn't mean conclusions have been reached. It means curiosity has hardened. And curiosity is harder to suppress than outrage. One of the most underestimated factors here is generational distance. Younger audiences don't have the same emotional attachment to legacy images. They didn't grow up with the mythology in real time. They're encountering these figures through fragmented clips, retrospectives, and context-heavy commentary. To them, nothing is sacred, everything is examinable. That shift alone changes how stories land. What once felt like disrespect now feels like overdue accountability. What once felt like gossip now feels like investigative curiosity. And that reframing removes many of the social consequences that used to keep people quiet. That's why even people who aren't directly involved are speaking more openly, not to accuse, but to contextualize, to explain how environments worked, how certain behaviors were normalized, how access was controlled, how careers could stall or surge based on invisible dynamics. Those stories don't need to name villains to be unsettling. They simply describe conditions. And when enough descriptions overlap, audiences draw their own conclusions, whether anyone wants them to or not. This is also where comparisons keep resurfacing, not because situations are identical, but because trajectories feel familiar. Reverence turning into scrutiny, protection turning into distance, silence turning into suspicion. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes enough to make people uneasy. What's unfolding now isn't a takedown, it's a test. A test of whether silence still works in an era where attention doesn't move on as quickly as it used to. A test of whether legal precision can outpace cultural curiosity. A test of whether image alone can withstand sustained questioning. And tests don't need immediate outcomes to matter. They just need to keep running. At this stage, even supporters are conflicted. Some defend out of loyalty, others defend out of principle. But many are simply waiting not to judge, but to see who speaks, who doesn't, and how long the quiet lasts. Because eventually one of two things happens. Either the silence breaks and explanations arrive, or it doesn't and narratives solidify without permission. Neither outcome is fully controllable anymore. And that's the shift. The center of gravity has moved away from those who once dictated how stories unfolded. It's now dispersed across platforms, voices, memories, and interpretations. Which means whatever happens next won't be decided by a single statement or a single clip. It will be decided by accumulation. And this is where everything converges. Because once a story reaches this stage, it's no longer about individual moments or isolated claims. It becomes about trajectory, about where things are heading, not where they started. And trajectories don't lie, they reveal direction. What's happening now feels less like an explosion and more like erosion. Slow, relentless, impossible to fully stop once it gains momentum. Every week without clarity adds another layer of interpretation. Every carefully worded statement adds another gap. And every gap gets filled by public curiosity. That's the part many powerful figures underestimate. People don't need confirmation to form conclusions. They only need consistency. And right now, what feels consistent to many observers is the absence of direct engagement. Not outrage, not transparency, just calculated quiet. In earlier eras, that approach worked because the audience moved on. Attention spans were shorter. Platforms were fewer. Gatekeepers were stronger. But that world doesn't exist anymore. Stories don't disappear, they archive themselves. Clips resurface. Quotes are replayed. Silence is revisited again and again with new context. And context is ruthless. Because what once seemed irrelevant can suddenly feel central when viewed through a different lens. A line from an old interview, a moment on a stage, a relationship that was downplayed at the time. None of it proves anything on its own, but together, it reshapes perception. And perception, once altered, is hard to reverse. That's why so many industry insiders believe this moment matters even if nothing official happens tomorrow. Because the shift isn't legal yet, it's cultural. And cultural shifts always come first. They soften ground. They change expectations. They redefine what people are willing to accept without explanation. This is where legacy starts being renegotiated, not erased, not destroyed, but questioned. And for figures who've spent decades controlling narrative distance, deciding what's close and what's far, what's visible and what's hidden, that loss of control is destabilizing. Because now even neutrality feels like a statement. Choosing not to speak is interpreted as strategy. Choosing lawyers over personal voice is interpreted as insulation. Choosing distance over acknowledgement is interpreted as avoidance. Again, interpretations, not verdicts. But interpretations shape reality just as powerfully. What happens next doesn't require dramatic revelations. It doesn't require leaks, indictments, or exposés. All it requires is time. Time for the conversation to keep circulating. Time for more people to feel safe enough to speak. Time for silence to feel heavier than words. And that's the irony. For years, silence was the shield. Now it's the spotlight. This isn't about choosing sides. It's about recognizing that the rules have changed. The era where influence alone could neutralize curiosity is ending. Audiences don't just consume stories anymore. They analyze them. They compare. They revisit. They remember. And they don't forget unanswered questions. Whether this moment fades or deepens depends on what comes next, not from commentators, not from rivals, but from the people at the center of the silence. Because eventually every strategy reaches a point where it has to evolve. And when it does, the response will tell us everything we need to know. Until then, the conversation continues not because anyone wants it to, but because it no longer belongs to any one person to control. If you've made it this far, I want to know your honest take. Do you think staying silent protects power or exposes it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Read what others are saying. This story isn't finished, and the discussion matters. And if you want more deep dives like this, the kind that connect dots instead of chasing noise, make sure you're subscribed. Because when the next shift happens, you won't hear it announced. You'll feel it.